It's a real honor to be here. To spend a weekend listening to good and holy priests is about my idea of as close to heaven as you can get on earth. But today I'm going to talk about a very difficult subject, and I want you to know that my motivation in discussing this is really captured in the diary entry number 481 of St. Faustina. And the diary entry goes like this. Oh, how much I love Holy Church and all those who live in it. I look upon them as living members of Christ, who is their head. I burn with love with those who love. I suffer with those who suffer. I am consumed with sorrow at the sight of those who are cold and ungrateful. And I then try to have such a love for God that it will make amends for those who do not love him, those who feed their Savior with ingratitude at its worst. This won't come as a surprise to any of you, but I've learned probably much more about the Catholic faith from John Vanari in the last year than in all my years of Catholic school education. Admittedly, I had 6 years at a Jesuit university, and I know those don't count. Well, Pope Francis pronounced that our God is a God of surprises, and indeed he is. I certainly found that out. However, I don't think that Pope Francis would appreciate the surprise that I uncovered when, as a lawyer who spent most of her life looking and advocating for missing and exploited children, should all of a sudden be researching and investigating the papacy of Jorge Bergoglio. To my utter shock and surprise, I will share with you what I learned. I'm glad you're sitting down because this has shaken me to my core. So let me preface my remarks that, full disclosure, I was a fan of Pope Francis because he immediately, in March of 2013, began talking about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, human trafficking. And so I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to go to his first human trafficking conference because I want to hear what he has to say about the subject that I've worked in most of my career. And I've spent the last 30 years of my legal career chasing sexual predators and searching for missing and exploited children. With the invaluable assistance of my investigative team, St. Michael, St. Anthony, and of course, the Blessed Mother. I have had success searching for clues, looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack, and tracking down leads and uncovering complex and covert criminal conspiracies of pedophile rings around the world. And in many ways, I was perfectly suited for the work that I was shocked to find myself doing in November of 2013. But a funny thing happened on the way to Rome. I must have taken a wrong turn. I took a left turn instead of a right one, and I landed at the Vatican Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at their International Human Trafficking Conference. And for 3 days, I sat there and felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. This couldn't be the Chair of Peter, the Holy See. The UN was there providing expertise and direction. The Obama administration was there. Radical NGOs were speaking about socialism at the conference. There were no opening prayers, and a closing prayer was an afterthought. I turned to a friend halfway through the conference and said, "Are we the only pro-lifers here? Are we at the Vatican?" Something was terribly wrong was going on. The first red flag was initially Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, was going to be on the conference schedule to speak. Why was he talking at a human trafficking conference, I thought? He knows nothing about human trafficking. He's an economist. He's a Soros advisor. I wondered, why would they invite him? I would eventually learn that Jeffrey Sachs shamelessly fashions himself an uber expert on almost everything global, despite his qualifications. This is the classic definition of global elites, who we're going to see a lot from today. Ivy-educated leftists, beneficiaries of leftist foundations who tell us how to live our lives. Others on the Vatican agenda had similar radical leanings, and incredibly, very few had any experience on human trafficking. The entire Vatican conference, from start to finish, left me completely unsettled, totally baffled, and my soul was rattled. I was left with one lingering and gnawing question. What is going on in the Vatican? Remember, this was November 2013, just 8 months into the Francis papacy. Were things really as I observed and experienced? I heard and witnessed a radical social agenda, the call for a global minimum wage, numerous rants about capitalism, and an underlying current of radicalism emanating from the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. I met Pope Francis, and I was in his presence, close presence, for about 30 minutes while he met other members of the trafficking delegation. My dreaded sense of malaise, unease, and suspicion lingered and never left me. As Augustine said, my heart is restless until it rests in thee. I was restless for answers. I began my investigation into the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences from that moment. When I served as general counsel at DCFS in Illinois, I investigated a young priest who was in active ministry and actively molesting little boys. The DCFS case involved a very public, high-pitched battle with the then Cardinal George. And I had the sad experience of looking at the shattering dark underbelly of the church. And after that crisis passed, I made a promise to God that I would remain vigilant, speak up, stay involved, and protective of Holy Mother Church from evil. I certainly thought that the next time I would be involved probably in a clergy abuse scandal or something else, but never this. I never imagined an investigation of a radical papacy which embraces UN environmentalism and the globalist agenda. I could not walk away. I could not remain silent as much as I wanted to. God has a sense of humor, taking me, who barely passed high school biology, as one who had to learn about the environmental, global warming, climate change, human trafficking agenda. This global warming scandal that I walked into very blindly was well beyond my pay grade. But what I saw at the Vatican in November of 2013 and was reaffirmed in April of 2015 when I returned to the Vatican as a member of the Heartland Institute delegation, a delegation of NASA scientists, MIT scientists, the most brilliant men in the world who went to the Vatican to try and get the Pope, who claimed that he wanted to dialogue on these issues, to listen to the other side of global warming. These are scientists who have spent their life looking at the climate, looking at this issue, and understood that this is a UN hoax. And it was extremely troubling to these gentlemen, these brilliant men, many of them who are retired, that the Pope, the popular Pope, was embracing the UN global agenda. The Pope did not meet with us, nor did any of the members of the Curia who we reached out to. Fair warning, when you hear about papal dialogue, The Francis dialogue consists of listening to only one side of the debate and evidence, and that side is the leftist, socialist, globalist side of the issue. The Heartland delegation of NASA scientists who put a man on the moon and the world's most prestigious geologists and climatologists were sent home without ever an opportunity to discuss their views, research, and science. In the words of one of the NASA scientists, Vatican, we have a problem. I gradually learned through intense research and investigation, this is the radical transformation of the Catholic Church, the abuse of power at the highest level. And like the clergy sex abuse scandal, the Episcopal hierarchy remains silent and is desperately attempting to muzzle and intimidate the laity into silence and complacency. This will not happen again, folks. We must speak up. Not to sound like an environmentalist, the climate has changed. So today, I want you to look at my ongoing journey to the center of the Vatican to uncover an unholy alliance between the Holy See, the Vatican, the United Nations, and George Soros. Folks, this story rivals any Dan Brown novel. Truth is stranger than fiction. Looking for clues and tips for missing children, I tracked and I researched every conference at the Vatican, every attendee, every document. My initial suspicions in November of 2013 began to be confirmed. I uncovered that the Pontifical Academy became the focal point, the mission command central for the promotion of the abortion-laden UN Sustainable Development Goals, with Jeffrey Sachs, the special advisor to the UN Secretary General, orchestrating the rollout of the Vatican joining the UN bandwagon for the approval of the Sustainable Development Goals. Under Benedict and John Paul II, the Pontifical Academy had one conference a year. It's the think tank where the intellectuals get together to discuss an issue. Certainly they don't discuss the rosary or mental prayer or confession, but profound issues like global warming. Francis has had a total of 16 conferences in 3 years, featuring the likes of Jeffrey Sachs, Ban Ki-moon, Bernie Sanders, to name a few. You know Bernie. And the topics range from environmentalism to sustainable development, to environmentalism to sustainable development. This was a power grab by the globalists and their agenda, and in their corner was Pope Francis. The pattern soon developed that the Vatican was cooperating with the UN agenda to pass the Sustainable Development Goals in September of 2015. And in fact, the Pope repeatedly said that he hoped Laudato Si, his environmental exhortation, would help to pass the abortion-laden, gender-bending, contraceptive-infused UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Vatican, through the leadership of Bishop Sarando, an Argentine bishop, I might add, appointed by John Paul II, who serves as the chancellor of the Pontifical Academy, and I'll show you his picture later, was building a groundswell of support for the Sustainable Development Goals, using 14, 15 conferences with various UN experts to push the UN climate change agenda. Sarando cleverly used the Pontifical Academy as the staging ground for the launching of the Vatican-UN partnership. As the Vatican's academic think tank, its chancellor, Bishop Sorondo, is a radical progressive. But he was suddenly empowered to carry out his extreme agenda when his fellow Argentine, Bergoglio, assumed the seat of Peter. You can, okay, there we go. That's just to confirm what I said, that I met the Bergoglio, or Pope Francis. Those were some of the members of the conference who were there. I guess they have the same dress on, don't they? Oh, that's appropriate. I wore blue that day because I thought, oh, Our Lady, I'll wear blue for Our Lady. And of course, wearing it today for her. But anyway, the Vatican sent a message loud and clear that it believed man caused global warming and was an environmental threat to the planet. Shockingly, the only experts who spoke at the Vatican were all population control proponents, longtime advocates of abortion. My fears were confirmed. Where are all the pro-lifers? Where are the scientific experts who debunk global warming and know that this is an issue that is a stalking horse for population control around the globe? The Unholy Alliance between the Vatican, the United Nations, and George Soros. And one of the things that I want to share with you is, as I go through these slides, I'm going to show you all the people that are George Soros's acolytes, operatives, in fact, his brain trust, are there embedded at the Vatican. Without a doubt, I recognized a number of troubling facts. As Michael Hitchborn of Lepanto and LifeSite News has demonstrated, the Sustainable Development Goals are the abortion contraceptive goals of the UN based on a faulty premise that man is causing global warming. Language and lies are their weapons. When the words global warming all of a sudden started being debunked, the language morphed into climate change, as if climate doesn't change. And when climate change began to be debunked in the scientific community, that morphed into sustainable development. Sounds lofty, doesn't it? Who could be against sustainable development? Which has now morphed into, and after Hurricane Matthew, that's morphed into extreme weather. So if you listen to the language of the left, I mean, as all of you folks know, choice, all the language that they choose is focus grouped, it's used to lure people into passivity and complacency, and to assume that their goals are lofty. Any extreme weather, I mean, you listen to your news, any extreme weather is now blamed on climate change caused by too many people on the planet. Climate change is based on faulty science and was manufactured as a justification, a ruse to impose population control on the world. Human beings create carbon dioxide, they argue, which is creating global warming. So we must reduce carbon dioxide. Therefore, the population of man must be drastically reduced. Yet carbon dioxide is the gas of life. It makes our trees green, our plants grow. And so what's really going on here with the UN? What's really going on? Well, the great MIT atmospheric scientist and physicist stated, and I think this is a great explanation of what the climate change movement is. Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. And if you read Laudato Si, if you struggle through the exhortation, you will see that much of the language just mirrors what the UN and the left global warming agenda is promoting. The environmental movement is all about power and control over our lives, down to the very electric smart meter that's attached to your home. In the Vatican conferences, they continue to blame the real crises in the world on climate change. What really caught my attention and when I decided I can't ignore this anymore is on the Vatican website. There was a statement by Bishop Sorondo. There is a nexus, a close connection between climate change and human trafficking. That's when I went, there is not even a recognition anymore of evil. Blaming climate change on a real tragic crisis. They're using a phony crisis like climate change and trying to bootstrap it to a real crisis. And they do this time and time again. After decades of the Vatican really stood as a firewall against the UN and its radical population control agenda. In fact, the very people who were battling in Beijing against the Vatican representatives are the very people now that are talking at the Vatican as their experts. That's when a handful of us began protesting, writing, and exposing the radical and dangerous and preposterous unholy alliance between the Vatican and the UN and the Obama administration. Gradually, I began to see another even more disturbing pattern emerge. My research uncovered that George Soros and his operatives infiltrated the Vatican and were given free rein to direct the Vatican's global warming environmental agenda and orchestrating the Vatican's exhortation on the environment. The Vatican agenda mimicked the UN eco agenda. These experts weren't merely passing acquaintances of George Soros. These individuals who were embedded in the Vatican were members of his closest advisory panels, his collaborators, and his brain trusts. My son likes to Photoshop pictures for me, but that I think after today's talk, you may share that view. Okay. This is the Pontifical Academy. It sits on the Vatican grounds. There it is, a 15th and 14th century beautiful a palace. And inside, that's where all the conferences were held. Just so you have a sense, the Vatican Gardens are right beyond there. Mission control. This is Archbishop Sorondo, the Chancellor of the Pontifical Academy from Argentina. He's fond of saying the UN is not the devil, quite the opposite. Well, then, if quite the opposite, then the UN must be good, I guess. And this is inside the Pontifical Academy. There's Pope Francis speaking. Sorondo is right next to Pope Francis, and right next to Sorondo is Jeffrey Sachs. This is the Soros Brain Trust. These two men, Jeffrey Sachs and Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz is a member, longtime member of the Pontifical Academy. He's an economist. He has written a number of books, as you will see, with George Soros. I think he's a lifetime member, if I'm not mistaken, of the Pontifical Academy. He even won a Nobel laureate prize in economics. He's, I think, affiliated with Columbia University, and he is the founding member of the International Socialist Conference, which also is funded by George Soros. The man on the end is Jeffrey Sachs. I don't think there's anybody who watches MSNBC in the room, but if you do, when Jeff Sachs is in town in New York, he's often on MSNBC, expounding on a number of issues. Jeff Sachs also was the economic advisor to Bernie Sanders, hence the invitation to Bernie Sanders. Jeff Sachs goes back, I think, 35 years with George Soros. Jeff Sachs, as a young economist from Harvard, was dispatched by George Soros to the USSR, the Soviet Union, Poland, Bolivia, when they all had struggling economies, when the USSR was falling. Jeff Sachs was one of the economists who was brought in to help get the economy back on its feet. In Russia, he failed miserably. I read something where Sachs is not even allowed to come to Russia anymore. But nevertheless, he and Soros are very close collaborators. Soros funds a number of Jeffrey Sachs initiatives at the UN to the tune of $50 million. And Jeff Sachs, Jeff Sachs, there you see the triumvirate of Soros, Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General. To me, it was very interesting to see what was really happening as I read news accounts of Jeff Sachs, as I read leaked documents in WikiLeaks. The left, the environmental left, had this united chorus that we have finally found our moral voice that we were looking for in the environmental movement. They were clearly quite aware of the successful accomplishment in getting Francis to buy into the UN environmental agenda. Ban Ki-moon came to the Vatican several times in the early part of Francis's papacy while all this discussion about the UN agenda was going on, and they were trying to form and shape the exhortation Laudato Si, the environmental exhortation by Francis. There he is meeting the Pope and introduced by Bishop Sarando, the Argentine bishop. So there were several meetings that were going on. Ban Ki-moon was especially effusive in his gratitude to the Pope for supporting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. UN? Yes, the Holy Father, or the UN is our friend. This is outside the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. These are several of the meetings of, a lot of these are globalists, the elites from the NGOs who come. Sachs, they're sitting in the first row. This, I think, is very interesting, and Americans should really pay attention to this. This is George Soros, a quote from George Soros at Davos, Davos in Switzerland, the big fancy meeting that all the CEOs of the world and hedge fund guys go to. In 1995, he said, "The world needs a new world order, and I am here to alert you that we are entering a period of world disorder." Well, what George Soros didn't happen to mention is that he himself was going to fund much of the world's disorder. Population control, proponents, and Soros operatives at the Pontifical Academy. Glad everybody's sitting down. Okay. And I think this is a message, if you take anything back with you, and this was, I think, in the Bloomberg News, and I thought, I can't believe they're coming out and saying this. That really what climate change is all about is about controlling the population. Stop having babies. They finally came out and said it. That's why we need to continue to battle this. Our pastor came out and said, we're not handing out paper bags anymore for the pantry because we're going green here. And we're going green, so we're not going to hand out paper bags anymore. So, you see this environmental agenda seeping down, not only at the top level, but into the parish level. I'm sure you are. You're going to hear in your local communities talks about sustainable development. That's what it's all about. It's about telling you how much energy you can use, how big your cars can be, and so on and so on, in addition to massive taxations, which I'll get into later. This is, in fact, I think he actually did say that the theology of environmentalism and that it's a sin to, did he say it's a sin to litter or something, certainly we should turn off all of our air conditioners. I wanted to remind him that I think it was in the summer of the 1990s when we had a big heat wave in Chicago, and a lot of the elderly people didn't have air conditioning, and I think something like 800 people died in a matter of a week. So air conditioning is, for many people, not a luxury, but a necessity. I think that had to be the first encyclical that mentioned air conditioning. These are the specific steps that the Vatican Pope Francis has endorsed and really has put the force and the moral force of the Vatican and the Catholic Church behind the radical, leftist, atheistic, environmental agenda. Laudate Si, which was a critical document, critical document that that the UN worked very hard to ensure that the timing would happen precisely before the vote, precisely before the Pope would come to the United States and there would be a vote at the UN General Assembly on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Following that vote, which the Pope said, I really hope Laudate Si will push the UN Sustainable Development Goals, over the passage, and they will become part of the UN General Assembly, and in fact they did. And then he said, in December, there is this worldwide global Paris Climate Treaty, which many of you may have heard about, and the Pope was very, very hopeful that Laudate Si would be used as the moral force behind the passage of the Paris Climate Treaty agreement, and mission was accomplished. Both of these terrible pieces of legislation, treaties, have passed. Let me just quickly go through Jeffrey Sachs, who seems to be the one who was dispatched by Soros and the UN. As I mentioned, beneficiary of $50 million of Soros funds, director of the Columbia University Earth Institute. He wears many, many hats. The lefts really do know how to, I would say double dip, but it's really like triple dip, quadruple dip. He's special advisor to the UN Secretary General and a long time, as I mentioned, Soros collaborator. He's spoken 18 times at the Vatican, 18 times. Keynote speaker. The Vatican also, calls him our greatest supporter. Francis did acknowledge the wonderful partnership with the UN, and as I mentioned, Laudate Si to help push the approval of the Paris Treaty and the SDGs. There is the meeting of Ban Ki-moon on your right, Bishop Saranda to the left of the Pope, Jeff Sachs, and the two interpreters. That's the close connection and nexus between, Francis and others can say, oh, well, it was a hands-off relationship. Quite the contrary. It was very intimate planning and strategy sessions regarding how to push forward the UN environmental agenda, not only at the UN, but also within the Catholic Church. And folks, it's in the religious ed programs. It's in the Catholic school curriculum now. Many of you may have heard about it from the pulpit. So we're just beginning to see the effects of this UN agenda. There's Jeffrey Sachs in one of his 18 keynote speeches right next to Sarando at the Pontifical Academy. Okay. There is Pope Francis speaking, acknowledging Jeffrey Sachs on the same dais together speaking at the Pontifical Academy. And that was, I think, June of this year. So it was very, not so long ago. And so again, because what I'm talking about is really hard for Catholics to take in, I wanted you to see for yourself. These are some of these pictures are ones that I found. I was sitting in that very room at the Human Trafficking Conference. So I wanted you to see the close collaboration in real life, in pictures. Joseph Stiglitz, who is a radical economists. Here he is with his longtime close friend, Soros. As I mentioned before, they're on panels together. They write books together. Joe Stiglitz is an honorary or full member lifetime member of the Pontifical Academy. He speaks many times at the Pontifical Academy. I mean, I kept on thinking, why can't they find a faithful Catholic, conservative Catholic economist? There must be thousands out there to put in the Pontifical Academy, but no, they pick the most radical of radicals, socialists, to serve. And by the way, Stiglitz was an appointment, I think John Paul II. But interestingly, it's like these seeds were just planted, by putting people like Stiglitz and others in Serrando in the Pontifical Academy during John Paul II and Benedict, and they didn't sprout until Francis became Pope. They all were very quiet, just laying in wait. There's the book, forward by George Soros. Jeff Sachs and Joe Stiglitz wrote the book. Okay. That's another book that they wrote together. Consultant to the, this is interesting, my next research project. Stiglitz is also, interestingly, a consultant to the Argentine government, to the last two presidents of Argentina. So he goes down to Argentina quite a bit and consults with them, gets paid, I'm sure, handsomely. But you can see, again, the enmeshment, the entanglement of all these globalists in issues that are, very close and dear to the Pope. Joe Stiglitz, believe it or not, here is the International Socialist Conference. Yes, they exist. And Father, one of the prime ministers of Belgium, Elio de Rupo, is two men away from Joe Stiglitz. This organization revolutionary organization, was funded by Soros and founded by Joe Stiglitz, and meets on a regular basis with politicians, heads of state who are socialists. Okay, everybody remembers this, right? When Bernie Sanders showed up at the Vatican, there's Jeff Sachs. Obviously, it was at the invitation of Sachs. He was squired around the Vatican. He even spoke at the Vatican. I don't know if there's any, maybe our State Department person. There's Evo Morales, the radical president of Bolivia, another honored guest at the Vatican, who spoke at the Pontifical Academy, sitting right next to Bernie Sanders, talking about what else, the dangers of capitalism and radical inequality in our country. I couldn't resist. Okay, this handsome, distinguished gentleman, Peter Raven, and I'm sure there's some people in the audience who may know, he's a botanist, and he's also a longtime member of the Pontifical Academy, and one of his longtime collaborators is a man by the name of Paul Ehrlich. Ever heard of the population bomb, that the world was overpopulated and England was going to fall into the seas in the late 1970s, and it really ushered in and laid the groundwork for the massive abortion contraceptive agenda that came flooding into the country and into the world in the late 1960s and 70s. Too many people, too little food, a dying planet. And back in the it sounds funny now, but back in the 19th, I can remember thinking, oh my gosh, we're all gonna die. There's not enough food for all the people in the world. Okay. By 1985, millions will have died to reduce the Earth's population to an acceptable level, like 1.5 billion people. These are the people that are speaking at the Vatican and advising the Vatican. This is Paul Ehrlich on Peter Raven, his close collaborator. He wrote this in the foreword of that insidious book, The Population Bomb. This is what he said about the Pontifical Academy board member. I'm indebted to my colleague Peter Raven, who has associated the work of the population explosion for many years. Much of his thinking is incorporated in this book. He has been kind enough to endorse the ideas expressed here. This is the latest appointment of Pope Francis. And you know, this guy's name is Hans Schellenhuber. He's a German scientist. You know, when you look at his face, you think God does have a sense of humor. You know, and this man has pushed in many writings and many research to reduce the population of the globe to 1 billion people, that too is an acceptable level. This is the appointment of Pope Francis. He was featured and discussed Laudate Si at the press rollout when they talked about the new exhortation. Hans Schellenhuber, this man was the Pope's spokesman. When you imagine that if all of these 9 billion people claim all these resources, then the earth will explode. I mean, that's the kind of, and you notice with these radicals, they're always, you know, pushing the panic button. They don't want to discuss a dialogue. They don't want to weigh the evidence. They certainly don't want to debate. They want to push, you know, Sachs is very often saying, we're at the tipping point. We've got about, 2 hours before the world's going to fall apart because we're all starving and there's too many damn people in the world. That is the kind of language. It's always pressing the button. Yeah, look at the press conference of Pope Francis when Laudate Si was unrolled. That was the guy who was speaking for him. Here are some more Soros operatives at the Vatican. Partha Dasgupta, he has been there for many years, a radical intellectual. He is a Soros. He's on the Soros board. He serves on the Earth Institute with Jeffrey Sachs. He is one of the radicals who promote population control. And Naomi Klein, she's a Canadian. You Canadians may have heard of her. She's very young, cute. She's proudly proclaims that she's an atheist and a feminist, and she's a self-styled environmentalist. And she was invited to and was featured at the Vatican to talk about Laudate Si. She is in an organization called, a nonprofit called 350.org, again, funded by George Soros. So Soros's tentacles are all over the place. Thanks to Hillary White at The Remnant, she exposed this woman. Emma Bonino is a Italian politician. She was known as, abortionist who killed tens of thousands of children in Italy. She serves on the prestigious Open Society board. That's George Soros's main NGO board, foundation board, very close associate of George Soros. She was greeted by Pope Francis, and Pope Francis called Bonino one of Italy's greats, which is like calling Kermit Gosnell one of America's greats. And but what triggered it for me is like, I was getting now pretty savvy, so I was like, I wonder if Bonino is got a connection to Soros. Sure enough, she's on her board. Sure enough, he gives her awards. Is that why Francis made sure that the world knew that that picture was taken and that his quote to her would be plastered all over the world? I mean, it's just scandalous. But again, another Soros close collaborative that gets close to Pope Francis. We in America can understand, Soros also funds, as folks know, Black Lives Matter. Remember Occupy Wall Street? Occupy Wall Street was on, in Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco. They were, all sorts of fights and activism, screaming about all the various inequities in the economic system. Well, interestingly, yet again, Soros is funding these activities, and who shows up to speak at the Occupy Wall Street events? Naomi Klein, who had 2 years later shows up at the Vatican. Jeffrey Sachs spoke to them, and Joe Stiglitz. There he is. There's Joe in the red. There's Joe Stiglitz. So you see, these are the kind of radicals. I mean, as if, their books and writings and speeches aren't radical enough. You can see now their activities and who they associate with. And this is the disorder that George Soros talked about in creating disorder back in 1995 at Davos. It's Black Lives Matters. It's taking the streets. It's Occupy Wall Street. This is one of the signs that is at the Occupy Wall Street. I mean, I didn't pay much attention to them. I had to walk over their trash on LaSalle Street in Chicago. But when I started researching the group, it's just, it's just despicable. But having been through the 60s, it's kind of, familiar to me. Okay. All right. After I had done all my research and said, Soros is there, Soros's people are there, the Pope is well aware that all these radicals are calling the agenda and using the moral voice of the Vatican, then DCLEAKS, which is it's not WikiLeaks, it's a bunch of hackers, uncover all the documents from George Soros' Open Society programs. I mean, if there's a God there, that was an example of beginning to pull back the curtain and seeing how the operation of this radical operates in the United States and around the world. And so DCLEAKS uncovered, and so I went into the search engine and went, I think I'll search for Vatican. Boom, all these documents pop up. I think I'll search for Francis. Boom, all these documents pop up. And sure enough, Open Society was giving money to radical NGOs to go to the Vatican to push the environmental and radical inequality agenda. So those documents were for everybody to see. And then WikiLeaks pops up, and there are all sorts of documents to John Podesta, chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign, about, remember that $650,000 that George Soros gave to the organization to go to the Vatican to meet with Serrando and Cardinal Maradiaga Rodriguez and Cardinal Turkson? Remember that $650,000? Did they ever go have that meeting? And did it actually happen? Sure enough, WikiLeaks described the meeting in glowing terms to coordinate the Pope's message with our election message. The Pope's message of, we must continue to race bait. We must continue to talk about Black Lives Matter. And in fact, the delegation that went to the Vatican was full of Black Lives Matter Protestant pastors. And so, it was, for me, it was a confirmation that, what I had found with the hard digging was now confirmed by WikiLeaks and DCLeaks. Soros himself in his Open Society identifies the Vatican. It's so interesting. They understand he's a popular pope. We need a moral voice. He can speak with moral authority. We can't speak with moral authority, but he can. And so Soros is smartly funding radical Catholic organizations. He creates these organizations, Catholic environmental organizations, that pose as Catholic, traditional Catholics, and they're not. And Soros declares that the lobbying effort where they sent the group to the Vatican, the Black Lives Matter pastor, a major success. And they're going to continue to keep in touch with the Vatican and coordinate messages. You cannot, as I said, Dan Brown novel. Okay. This is Cardinal Mary Diaga, who is mentioned a great deal in the Soros leaks. And he is the vice pope. Francis has a kind of a kitchen cabinet of 9 cardinals that he chose, and the vice pope, or the head of that cabinet of 9 cardinals, is Cardinal Mary Diaga of Honduras. Very clever guy, speaks, 5, 8 languages, and he has been identified by Soros and Clinton people as someone who they can work with and who will help fashion a political message that will be in line with theirs. This was the actual message, one of the emails that was in the DCLEAKS. Okay, well, dark clouds over the Vatican. After spending the last 3 years researching and investigating and witnessing firsthand, I'm convinced that this is an intentional and coordinated alliance between the Vatican, the UN, and Soros. The radical one world order agenda is hidden and obscured by the false and manufactured climate change movement. Shockingly, the movement found and secured its missing power broker, its missing link, its long sought after moral voice. The golden ring of the papacy was won and secured by George Soros through infiltration at the Vatican. Folks, take note. They are moving at lightning speed. Mission has been accomplished on the environmental agenda. The New World Order is well underway. The global warming globalists have secured a perfectly timed, coordinated Vatican apostolic exhortation, Laudate Si, written intentionally and fortuitously in time for the UN vote on the Sustainable Development Goals. Then Pope Francis spoke at the UN General Assembly, and that was timed on the very day that the vote occurred and was passed. Francis repeatedly said he hoped that his exhortation would help pass the SDGs and the Paris Climate Treaty. The unthinkable happened. The Paris Climate Treaty passed in December of 2015, a mere 8 months after the issuance of Laudate Si. Soros operatives pulled off a miracle with the most popular man in the world. Who is George Soros? He is anti-God, anti-American, anti-capitalist. Even though he's a billionaire, he is pro-abortion. He lavishly funds millions on Planned Parenthood, Hillary Clinton, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and countless leftist media outlets. He seeks one world order governed by the elites. Make no mistake, this is about tyranny. This is the megalomaniac that bragged that he considered himself a god. This is George Soros, and that he was even the Pope's boss. That was in the early 2000s. That has now become a fact. Suddenly it appears his prophecy has come true. Countless Soros operatives are embedded to this day at the Vatican. They have drafted Vatican documents and set the Soros agenda, which mirrors the Francis agenda. Mass migration, which George Soros funds, Black Lives Matter, environmentalism. The gig's up. We are in a death struggle with a secular culture and a global domination of elitists who seek to reduce the world's population by force, redefine marriage and gender, and govern by tyranny. As the photos demonstrate, and as you saw, Pope Francis shared the speaker's podium with Jeffrey Sachs and expressed his gratitude to the UN for its partnership. Jeffrey Sachs was touted as the Pontifical Academy's greatest supporter. We now know that Soros directed money to influence the USCCB and to coordinate with the Vatican through Cardinal Maradiaga. The mortal enemy of the Church has breached the Vatican walls and now is encamped there. The author Michael Crichton said that the greatest challenge facing mankind is the challenge of distinguishing reality from fantasy, truth from propaganda. What is the reality about our world and those that seek to control humanity by tyranny, demagoguery, nuanced language, and facile lies? The left has given the world the sin of the century, which is the sin against the child. More children have been willfully killed by adults during the last 100 years than in a whole preceding history of humanity. In the last 50 years, the eradication of the child is promoted by none other than the United Nations and funded by the mega billionaire George Soros through his many open society foundations. The abject horror that these two entities are given a prominent role, a seat at the Holy See, that they have infiltrated the chair of Peter, that they have formed an unholy alliance is beyond imaginable, but it is a reality we cannot deny. The globalists, they control the media. They own the wealth. They head all the wealthy foundations and now tragically and infuriatingly direct the Vatican and its megastar Pope. We can no longer play prevent defense. It is time to go on the offense. What are we to do? This might be the final fight, or it could be the definitive battle for the freedom of mankind. They have the money. We have the truth. They have the power and the influence. We have the truth. They have the powerful UN. We have the Blessed Mother. No other weapon do we need. This is Holy Mother Church that has been invaded by marauders of death. They are inside the walls. They are issuing edicts, plotting new strategies in the cover of darkness. We must shine the light on them. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, but we must speak up and do battle. I presume that everyone here was confirmed. You are a soldier of Christ. Well, it's time to re-enlist as the dark clouds envelop the Holy See, our beloved Holy Mother Church. You are Our Lady's army of advocates. You understand the cautionary words of C.S. Lewis, which mirrors a Chestertonian ethic. C.S. Lewis said, "Enemy-occupied territory, that is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. When you go to church, you are really listening in to the secret wireless from our friends. That is why the enemy is so anxious to prevent us from going." This has all been uncomfortable and terrifying, I know, but I am reminded of Saint Therese, the little flower, the sweet, genteel young saint. During her postulancy, she discovered the words of our Lord in St. Matthew's Gospel, "I came not to bring peace, but a sword." In her letter to her beloved sister Celine, the little flower wrote, "There remains nothing else for us to do but to fight. And when we don't have the strength, It is then that Jesus fights for us. At the end of her life, in August of 1897, she said with the defiance of a battle-worn warrior, "I shall die with weapons in my hand." Our Lady, Queen of Heaven and Earth, pray for us.